Vows spoken in a cold stone church do not warm a marriage bed. He looked at her, not as a bride, but as a burden. A fragile thing forced upon him by dead fathers. "You were never my choice," he told her, abandoning her in a sprawling, empty manner. He expected her to fade away. He was wrong. This is the story of a proud duke who discarded his sickly wife, only to spend years learning how to beg for her forgiveness. Rain lashed against the stained glass of St. Jude's, casting fractured, bruised colours across the stone floor. Bailey Williams kept her gaze fixed on a jagged crack near the altar steps. If she focused on the crack, she did not have to look at the man standing beside her. If she focused on the crack, she could control the shallow, ragged rhythm of her breathing. Her corset, laced tightly to give her the illusion of health, pressed against her ribs like an iron cage. Every inhalation was a negotiation. Every exhalation was a surrender. Beside her stood Antonio Langley, the Duke of Ashbourne. He smelled of rain-dampened wool, expensive saddle leather, and barely suppressed rage. He had not looked at her once since she walked down the aisle. The vicar's voice droned on, speaking of holy matrimony and eternal bonds. Antonio's jaw tightened. Bailey could see the muscle ticking beneath his skin. He was 30 years old, robust, entirely in command of his world, until his late father's debts had forced him into a corner. The Williams family had money, new and heavily industrial, but enough of it to buy a dukedom for a daughter with failing lungs. Bailey's father wanted a title before his daughter died. Antonio wanted his ancestral home free of creditors. They were a transaction. Neither pretended otherwise. "I will," Antonio said. The words clipped the air, sharp and unyielding. "I will," Bailey rasped. Her voice lacked the strength to echo in the cavernous church. It was a dry, papery sound. They did not kiss. They signed the registry in silence. The carriage ride to Ashbourne Manor took 3 hours, during which Antonio stared out the window at the bleak, rain-soaked moors, his arms crossed over his chest. Bailey focused on the steady rocking of the carriage, pressing a linen handkerchief to her lips whenever the damp air provoked a cough. She tried to muffle the sound. She knew how ugly her illness was. She knew the wet, rattling noise in her chest disgusted him. When they finally arrived, the sheer scale of Ashbourne Manor loomed out of the fog, a hulking beast of grey stone and black slate. Servants lined the entrance hall, their faces carefully blank. Antonio stripped off his gloves and tossed them onto a silver tray. "Show her grace to the east wing," Antonio commanded the housekeeper, a stern woman with iron-grey hair. He finally turned his gaze to Bailey. His eyes were the colour of a winter sea, pale and unforgiving. "I will be up shortly." Bailey nodded, conserving her breath. The stairs were a torture. By the time she reached the heavy oak door of the master suite, dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. Her maid, a young girl named Clara, who looked terrified of the cavernous house, helped Bailey out of the heavy silk wedding gown. Freed from the corset, Bailey collapsed onto the edge of the four-poster bed, coughing into her handkerchief until she tasted the familiar, metallic tang of copper. She was sitting there, wrapped in a thin velvet dressing gown, staring at a fire that barely warmed the massive room when the door opened. Antonio did not knock. He walked in, poured himself a glass of brandy from a crystal decanter on a side table, and leaned against the mantelpiece. The flames threw harsh shadows across his face. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the crackle of burning wood and the slight wheeze of Bailey's breathing. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "I will not make a mockery of this situation by pretending," he began, his voice low, lacking any inflection of warmth. "My father bankrupted this estate. Your father purchased it. We are legally bound, Bailey. That is where my obligation begins and ends." Bailey held her handkerchief tight in her lap. She felt no shock, no sudden welling of tears. She had expected this. She preferred it to false pity. "I understand, Your Grace," she said softly. Antonio's eyes narrowed. Perhaps he had expected hysterics. He had certainly braced himself for them. "I will ensure you are comfortable. You will have whatever medical care you require. You may decorate this wing as you see fit. But you will not expect me to play the doting husband. I have a life in London, and responsibilities here that do not involve holding your hand." He took a slow sip of the brandy, his gaze fixed on her frail, slumped form. "You were never my choice." The words hung in the cold air, designed to strike deep, designed to establish the impenetrable wall between them. Bailey looked at him. She took a slow, rattling breath, marshalling her meager strength. She did not shrink back into the shadows of the bed curtains. "You flatter yourself, Ashbourne," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying a dry, cutting edge. "Did you think you were mine?" Antonio froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. "My father bought a title," she continued, suppressing the urge to cough. "I am merely the vessel that carries the deed. I do not want your affection. I do not want your company. All I require is quiet, a good fire, and for you to close the door on your way out. The draft in this house is terrible." Antonio stared at her. The silence stretched, heavy and tense. He looked at the pale, sunken hollows of her cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, and the defiant, cynical spark in her gaze. He set the glass down on the mantelpiece with a sharp clink. Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked out. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, sealing her in the quiet. Bailey finally allowed the cough to tear through her chest, curling into a tight ball on the massive, empty bed. She had survived her wedding day. Now she just had to survive her marriage. Months bled into one another, marked only by the changing colors of the moors outside Bailey's window. Antonio was true to his word. He departed for London 3 days after the wedding, citing urgent parliamentary business. When he did return to Ashbourne, he kept to the West Wing, taking his meals in his study, riding out before dawn, and avoiding the East Wing as though it were quarantined. To the servants, Bailey was a phantom. They expected her to quietly expire in her bed, another tragic, brief footnote in the Ashbourne lineage. But Bailey had not survived 22 years of a failing body by being passive. Her physical world was agonizingly small, limited by the capacity of her lungs, but her mind was sharp, restless, and starved for purpose. It started with the Ledgers. During her 3rd week at the manor, confined to a chaise lounge by a vicious bout of bronchitis, Bailey asked Clara to bring her the household accounts. Mrs. Higgins, the formidable housekeeper, delivered them herself, her expression a mix of skepticism and protective territoriality. "The steward usually handles these, Your Grace," Mrs. Higgins said, her hands folded primly over her apron. "The steward is currently overseeing an estate that is leaking money from its roof and its cellars, Mrs. Higgins," Bailey replied, propping herself up on her pillows, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose. "Leave them, and please send up a pot of strong black tea." Over the next month, between coughing fits and visits from the local apothecary, Bailey dismantled the estate's domestic finances. She found waste, she found rot, and she found decades of quiet theft by minor suppliers. She did not yell or throw tantrums. She simply called the offending merchants to the manor, sat them down in her parlor while wrapped in thick woolen shawls, and presented them with the mathematics of their deceit in her quiet, raspy voice. She fired the corrupt butcher. She renegotiated the coal delivery. She noticed that the tenant farmers in the lower valley were being overcharged for mill usage by the steward, a man Antonio had trusted blindly. When Antonio returned from London in late autumn, the atmosphere in the house had subtly shifted. He walked into the entrance hall expecting the usual gloomy silence. Instead, the brass was polished, the fires were roaring, and the household staff moved with a brisk, purposeful energy. He found Mrs. Higgins in the corridor. "Where is Mr. Dawes?" Antonio asked, seeking the steward to discuss the harvest yields. Mrs. Higgins didn't blink. "Her Grace dismissed Mr. Dawes 3 weeks ago, Your Grace." Antonio stopped dead. "She what?" "Dismissed him, sir. Found he'd been skimming from the tenant rents and falsifying the grain weights. Her Grace has the ledgers in her parlour, if you wish to review the evidence." Antonio felt a sudden, irrational spike of anger. How dare she interfere? He took the stairs 2 at a time, marching towards the east wing. He did not knock before throwing open the door to her private parlour. Bailey was seated by the window, a thick wool blanket draped over her knees. Across from her sat a man Antonio did not recognize, a young, sharp-featured gentleman in a tweed suit. They were leaning over a sprawling map of the estate, deep in conversation. Bailey looked up, unbothered by his dramatic entrance. "Ah, you are back." She coughed lightly into a handkerchief, tucked it away, and gestured to the man. "Ashbourne, this is Dr. Oliver Hayes. He has recently taken over the practice in the village." Antonio stared at the doctor, then at the map. "What is going on here? And where is Dawes?" "Dawes is a thief," Bailey said simply. "Dr. Hayes was just explaining the drainage issues in the lower valley. It seems the damp is causing a localized outbreak of ague among the tenant children. The cottages need their roofs repaired and the soil drained." "You fired my steward." "I excised a tumour from your estate," Bailey corrected, her voice calm. "He was stealing from you. I saved you £400 this quarter alone. The ledgers are on the desk." Antonio looked at the heavy leather books neatly stacked on the mahogany desk. He felt wrong-footed, foolish in his own home. He looked at Dr. Hayes, who was watching the Duke with a quiet, analytical gaze. "And since when does a physician consult on estate drainage?" Antonio snapped. "Since the Duke is in London and the Duchess cannot walk the fields herself to see the mud." Dr. Hayes replied smoothly, standing up. "Medicine is not just about treating the fever, Your Grace. It is about fixing the damp that causes it. Her Grace understands this." Antonio bristled at the subtle reprimand. He looked back at Bailey. She looked paler than he remembered, the shadows under her eyes bruised and deep, but her posture was rigid with quiet authority. "I will review the ledgers," Antonio said stiffly. "Do not dismiss my senior staff again without consulting me." "Then do not spend 3 months in London while your people are robbed," she replied, picking up her teacup. Her hands trembled slightly from the weight of the porcelain, a betraying sign of her physical weakness. "Good afternoon, Ashbourne." Antonio turned and left, his jaw clenched. When he finally opened the ledgers in his study, he expected to find a mess of confused arithmetic. Instead, he found brilliant, meticulous clarity. Bailey had not just stopped the bleeding, she had reorganized the accounts to be efficient. In the margins, in elegant, spidery handwriting, were notes on crop rotation and tenant welfare. He sat in the quiet of his study, staring at her handwriting. He had left a dying girl in a dusty wing to be forgotten. He had returned to find a duchess quietly ruling his domain from a sickbed. Winter arrived with a brutality the Moors had not seen in a decade. For 3 weeks in January, the snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, burying the roads and isolating Ashbourne Manor from the rest of the world. Antonio had intended to leave for London before the new year, preferring the distractions of his club to the quiet tension of the manor. The roads had frozen solid the night before his departure, trapping him. He spent his days in the library, restless and irritable. He rarely saw Bailey. She was having a bad month. Dr. Hayes braved the snow on horseback twice a week, disappearing into the east wing with a leather bag of tinctures and steam treatments. The sound of Bailey's coughing sometimes echoed down the long stone corridors at night, a hollow, scraping sound that made Antonio's stomach knot with an emotion he refused to examine. On the night of the worst blizzard, The wind howled like a wounded animal against the manor's thick walls. Antonio was in the drawing room, nursing a glass of whiskey, staring into the fire. Suddenly, the heavy double doors burst open. Mrs. Higgins stood there, her usual immaculate composure shattered. She was clutching a shawl around her nightgown, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Your Grace!" "It's the lower village." The roof of the main weaving shed collapsed under the snow. The tenants had moved in there because their cottages flooded when the river froze and backed up. Antonio stood up, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the hearth. "How many people?" 40, Your Grace. Men, women, children. Mr. Miller just rode up. He says they are freezing. Several are injured from the timber." Antonio's mind raced, struggling to formulate a plan. "Rouse the grooms. Get the sledges. We need to bring them to the village hall." "The village hall's roof is sagging too, sir." Mrs. Higgins interrupted. "Her Grace has already given the orders." Antonio blinked. "Her Grace." "She's in the great hall, sir." Antonio pushed past the housekeeper and ran down the corridor. When he reached the balcony overlooking the great hall, he stopped dead, his hands gripping the stone balustrade. The cavernous hall, usually cold and empty, was a hive of frantic, organized activity. All 20 of the manor's servants were moving at a dead sprint. Mattresses were being dragged from the upper guest rooms and lined up on the stone floor. Massive fires roared in the twin hearths. Maids were tearing sheets into bandages, and the footmen were hauling vats of boiling water and stacks of blankets from the cellars. And in the center of it all, leaning heavily on a cane she had never before allowed him to see her use, was Bailey. She was wearing a thick woolen dressing gown, her hair tied back in a messy braid. Her face was grey, a stark, terrifying color, and a sheen of sweat coated her forehead despite the draughty hall. She was pointing, giving orders in a voice that was barely a rasp, yet carried enough authority to cut through the panic. "Put the children near the east hearth," Bailey ordered, doubling over as a violent cough tore through her. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, held it there for a terrifying second, and then straightened up, leaning heavily on the cane. "Mrs. Higgins, clear the kitchens. Hot broth and bread. I want the dining tables broken down and used as splints if necessary." The heavy oak doors of the manor opened, letting in a blast of swirling snow. Men and women stumbled inside, covered in frost, shivering violently. Some were bleeding, others carried crying children. Antonio ran down the stairs, jumping the last 3 steps. "Bailey!" he shouted over the wind. She turned to look at him. There was no time for their usual Cold War. "Ashbourne, take 3 men to the stables. We need the draft horses to pull the heavy timbers off the remaining structures. Dr. Hayes is already down there." "You need to sit down," Antonio said, reaching out to grab her arm. She felt like a bundle of twigs beneath the heavy wool. "You're going to kill yourself." She yanked her arm out of his grip with shocking ferocity. Her eyes blazed with a fierce, desperate light. "These are your people, Antonio. They are bleeding on your floor. Go and do your duty or get out of my way." Antonio stared at her. For the first time in his life, he felt entirely small. He turned to the footman. "With me!" he roared, rushing out into the blizzard. The next 6 hours were a blur of freezing mud, screaming wind, and agonizing labor. Antonio hauled timber until his hands bled through his gloves. He pulled a trapped child from beneath a collapsed beam. He worked alongside his grooms, his tenants, and Dr. Hayes, stripped of his title by the brutal equality of survival. When the sun finally began to rise, painting the snow in pale, bruised hues of purple and grey, the last of the survivors had been brought up to the manor. Antonio walked into his great hall, covered in soot, mud, and frozen blood. The hall looked like a battlefield hospital. Every mattress was occupied. Servants moved quietly, distributing broth and tending to wounds. The tenants looked up as Antonio entered, their eyes following him with a mixture of awe and weary gratitude. He didn't care about their stares. His eyes swept the room, searching. He found her near the grand staircase. Bailey was sitting on the bottom step. She had given her thick woolen dressing gown to an elderly woman who was shivering on a nearby mattress. She sat in only her thin cotton nightdress, her arms wrapped around her knees. Dr. Hayes was kneeling beside her, holding her wrist, his face grim. Antonio hurried over, his heavy boots echoing on the stone. As he approached, Bailey looked up at him. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to ask about the remaining tenants, or perhaps to deliver another sharp reprimand. Instead, her eyes rolled back. She pitched forward, slipping off the step. Antonio lunged. He caught her before she hit the stone floor. She weighed absolutely nothing. It was like catching a handful of dry leaves. He pulled her against his chest, dropping to his knees. Her skin was freezing, burning with a terrible, paradoxical fever. Her hand fell limp over his arm. Tangled in her fingers was the handkerchief she had been using all night. Antonio looked at it. It was soaked through with bright, fresh crimson. "Bailey," Antonio breathed, the sound tearing out of his throat, stripped of all pride, all distance, all arrogance. "Bailey." She did not answer. The only sound was the ragged, wet rattle deep in her failing chest. Dr. Hayes looked up at Antonio, his eyes hard and accusing. "Carry her upstairs, Your Grace. Slowly. If her lungs fill any more, she will drown before noon." Antonio gathered his wife into his arms, pressing her face against his neck. He stood up, feeling the gaze of 100 tenants on his back. They were not looking at the Duke of Ashbourne. They were looking at the man holding the woman who had saved them. As he carried her up the massive, winding staircase, feeling her shallow breath flutter against his skin like a dying bird, Antonio realized the terrifying truth. He had spent his marriage trying to avoid her, trying to outrun the burden of her existence. Now, holding her broken body against his chest, he realized she was the only thing holding his world together. And she was slipping right through his fingers. The smell of the East Wing was no longer just old dust and lavender. It was camphor, boiling water, and the sharp, metallic stench of old blood. For 4 days and 4 nights, the blizzard held Ashbourne Manor in a chokehold. Inside the Master Dawit, a different kind of storm raged within Bailey's chest. Antonio did not leave the room. He dragged a heavy leather armchair to the side of the 4-poster bed and anchored himself there. He stripped off his ruined coat, rolled up his shirt sleeves, and stepped into the brutal, unromantic reality of his wife's existence. There was no dignity in her illness. It was a violent, ugly war of attrition. When the coughing fit struck, her entire body seized. Antonio had to hold her upright so she wouldn't choke on the fluid filling her lungs. He learned the exact pressure required to support her frail rib cage without bruising the translucent skin. He learned how to swap a soiled, blood-specked basin for a clean one before Dr. Hayes even had to ask. He watched Clara, the young maid, weep from exhaustion, and he quietly ordered the girl to bed, taking over the task of wiping the cold sweat from Bailey's brow with a damp cloth. Dr. Hayes remained a permanent fixture, sleeping in short bursts on the chaise lounge. On the 3rd night, as Antonio held a steaming bowl of eucalyptus water under Bailey's chin to ease her airways, the doctor watched him over the rim of a teacup. "You are doing it wrong," Hayes said quietly. Antonio's head snapped up, his eyes bloodshot, his jaw stubbled and hard. "She is breathing, is she not? You are holding her too rigid," Hayes instructed, walking over. "She needs to expand her diaphragm. Let her lean forward against your arm. Yes, like that." Antonio adjusted his grip. Bailey slumped heavily against his forearm. She was burning with fever, her head lolling against his shoulder. Her hair, usually pinned up in a severe, practical style, fell across his chest in limp, damp strands. "Will she survive the night?" Antonio asked. The question tasted like ash. "I am a physician, Your Grace, not a priest," Hayes replied, turning back to his medical bag to mix another tincture of laudanum. Her lungs are scarred. The cold exposure weakened her heart. She survives because she is too stubborn to do otherwise. But the body has limits. Antonio looked down at her. He traced the blue veins visible beneath the skin of her hand. I left her alone here, for months. You did, Hayes agreed, offering no absolution. She spent those months ensuring your tenants didn't freeze, your ledgers balanced, and your roof held. She built a fortress out of this estate while confined to a sickbed. What have you built, Ashbourne? The words stung, precise and deserved. Antonio had no answer. He simply tightened his hold on his wife, anchoring her to the waking world as she fought for her next breath. The fever broke on the morning of the 5th day. The howling wind outside finally died, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. The pale winter sun cut through the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Antonio was asleep in the chair, his chin resting on his chest, his hand still loosely gripping hers. He woke to the feeling of a weak, trembling finger tapping against his knuckles. He jerked upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Bailey was awake. Her eyes, sunken deep into the bruised hollows of her face, were open and fixed on him. Her lips were cracked, her skin grey, but the fierce, analytical intelligence was back in her gaze. "Antonio!" she rasped. It was a terrible sound, barely a croak, tearing at her dry throat. He immediately grabbed the glass of water from the nightstand, supporting her neck and bringing the rim to her lips. She took a tiny sip, swallowed painfully, and fell back against the pillows. "The miller's boy," she whispered, her brow furrowing. "Did they save his leg from the timber?" Antonio stared at her. He felt a sudden, massive pressure behind his eyes, a swelling of an emotion he had spent his entire adult life suppressing. She had almost drowned in her own blood. She was barely conscious, and her first thought was a tenant's child. "Hayes set the bone," Antonio said, his voice thick, rough. "The boy will walk with a limp, but he kept the leg. The villagers are safe. The hall is secure. You saved them." Bailey closed her eyes, letting out a long, slow breath. "Good. You need to rest," Antonio urged, leaning closer. "Don't speak. Just breathe." She opened her eyes again, looking at him with a strange, detached curiosity. She noted his unkempt hair, his wrinkled shirt, the dark circles mirroring her own. "You are still here. I am not leaving." A faint, cynical smile touched the corners of her mouth. It was a ghost of an expression, but it carried weight. "Guilt is a heavy master, Ashbourne. Don't let it keep you from London. I prefer my peace." She turned her head away, staring at the canopy above. She was too exhausted to fight, but her walls were fully intact. Antonio felt a cold stone drop in his stomach. He had stayed. He had bled for her people. He had held her while she fought death. But to her, he was still just the man who had abandoned her. The man who had told her, on their wedding day, that she was a burden. He deserved nothing less. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "London can burn," he said quietly. "I am staying." March arrived, turning the frozen moors into an ocean of brown mud and pale green shoots. The snow melted, revealing the full extent of the damage to the estate, but also revealing the relentless, quiet machinery Bailey had put in place to fix it. Antonio did not return to his study in the West Wing. He moved his desk, his papers, and his decanters into Bailey's private parlour. She did not invite him to do so. He simply ordered the footman to carry the heavy mahogany desk across the manor one afternoon, ignoring Mrs. Higgins's raised eyebrows. Bailey was confined to her bed for another 6 weeks. The pneumonia had ravaged her already fragile lungs, leaving her weaker than she had been on her wedding day. She could not walk to the window without gasping for air, but her mind demanded work, and so an unspoken routine developed between them. Every morning, after Dr. Hayes had visited, and Clara had helped Bailey into a fresh dressing gown and propped her up against a mountain of pillows, Antonio would enter with the day's correspondence. He did not read her poetry. He did not attempt to hold her hand or offer empty, flowery praises. He knew she would see right through it. Instead, he brought her the crop yield estimates. He brought her the timber merchant's contracts. He brought her the architectural plans for the new weaving shed. He sat at the desk in her room, turning the chair so he faced her bed, and he read the numbers aloud. The timber yard in York is quoting 10% higher for the oak beams, Antonio said one Tuesday, frowning at a heavy piece of parchment. They claim the winter delayed the logging. Bailey was staring at the ceiling, a hot brick wrapped in flannel resting against her aching chest. "Check the ledger from last October," she instructed, her voice thin but steady. "I locked in a fixed price for spring delivery with their competitor in Leeds. Tell the York yard we decline their offer, and remind them that we supply the coal for their drying kilns. If they raise the timber price, we raise the coal tax." Antonio found the entry in the ledger exactly where she said it would be. He looked up, watching the slow, labored rise and fall of her chest. "You are ruthless." "I am practical," she corrected him. "You cannot afford to be sentimental with merchants." "And what of husbands?" he asked. The question slipped out before he could stop it. The room went entirely still. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Bailey turned her head on the pillow, looking at him. Her eyes were sharp, evaluating. "Husbands are a matter of law, not sentiment," she replied coolly. "You made that exceptionally clear on our wedding day." Antonio set the contract down on the desk. He stood up, running a hand through his hair. He walked over to the window, looking out at the muddy fields, the repairing roofs, the life returning to his land, a life she had preserved. "I was a coward, Bailey," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried across the room. He did not turn around. He couldn't look at her while he stripped away his own pride. "A coward?" she echoed, a dry edge of disbelief in her tone. "You are many things, Ashbourne, arrogant, absent, terribly impatient. But I have seen you pull a beam off a child in a blizzard. You are not a coward." "Physical bravery is cheap," Antonio countered, gripping the wooden windowsill until his knuckles turned white. "It requires only adrenaline. Real cowardice is looking at a woman who is dying and running away to London because you are terrified of the grief." He finally turned to face her. The distance between the window and the bed felt like a chasm. "When my father died, he left me drowning in debt," Antonio continued, his voice tight. "Felt entirely helpless. Then I married you. I looked at you, pale, coughing, struggling to walk up a flight of stairs, and all I saw was another loss waiting to happen, another helplessness. So I built a wall. I told myself you were a transaction. I told myself you were not my choice, so I wouldn't have to care when you inevitably slipped away." Bailey watched him. She did not interrupt. Her face was an unreadable mask, but her breathing had hitched, becoming slightly more rapid. "But you didn't fade away," Antonio said, taking a slow step towards the bed. "You stayed. You fought. You took a bankrupt estate and a hollow house, and you forged a kingdom out of it from a sickbed. You are the strongest person I have ever known, and I spent a year hiding from you because I was afraid of the dark." He stopped at the foot of her bed. He didn't try to touch her. He just stood there, laying his absolute failure bare before her. "I am not asking for your forgiveness, Bailey. I do not deserve it," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I am asking you to let me stay. Let me be your hands when you cannot walk the fields. Let me be your voice when you cannot shout down the merchants. Let me do my job." Bailey stared at him for a long, heavy minute. The cynicism that usually shielded her gaze wavered, just slightly, revealing the exhausted, lonely woman beneath the armor. She looked at his hands, scarred from the timber he had moved to save her tenants. She looked at the desk he had dragged into her room, just to be near her. She let out a slow, rattling breath. "The ledger from Leeds," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Bring it here. You read the figures too fast, and your handwriting is atrocious. If you are going to be my hands, you will learn to write legibly." Antonio felt a sudden, sharp ache in his throat. It wasn't forgiveness. It was work. It was a partnership. It was a crack in the wall. He nodded, turning back to the desk. "Yes, Your Grace, right away." Summer baked the moors into a dry, golden crisp, yet the heat offered no clemency to the heavy, stagnant air of the east wing. Bailey's illness was not a straightforward decline. It was a cruel, unpredictable tide. Some weeks she could walk the length of the corridor, leaning heavily on her silver-tipped cane, her mind sharp and her tongue sharper. Other weeks, the mere act of sitting upright left her gasping, her lips tinged with a terrifying, bruised blue. Antonio became the master of this tide. He learned the subtle shift in her breathing that signaled an oncoming fever. He knew precisely when to summon Dr. Hayes and when to simply close the ledger, plunge the room into darkness, and sit quietly in the corner while she slept. He was her proxy in all things. When the striking coal miners in the neighboring county threatened to block the supply lines, Antonio did not send a letter. He rode out himself, armed with Bailey's precise calculations regarding their union's strike fund and her offer of a localized grain subsidy. He negotiated exactly as she had instructed, firmly, fairly, and without an ounce of aristocratic condescension. He returned 3 days later, smelling of horse sweat and coal dust, to find her awake by the window. He dropped the signed agreement onto her lap. They accepted the grain subsidy in exchange for uninterrupted rail access, Antonio reported, unbuttoning his soiled waistcoat. He poured himself a glass of water, watching her scan the document. "You conceded the rail access tariff?" she asked, her brow furrowing, coughing lightly into a lace square. "I did. They were hungry, Bailey. Men with hungry children do not care about long-term infrastructure tariffs. They needed a win they could take home to their wives." She looked up, her expression unreadable. A year ago, the Duke of Ashbourne would have called in the local militia to break a strike. Now he was arguing the psychological necessity of yielding to starving men. It was a good concession, she finally said, rolling the parchment and setting it aside on a side table. "It buys loyalty, which is far cheaper than funding a militia." Their evenings had become a quiet sanctuary. After the estate business concluded, Antonio would remain in the room. He discovered she had a vicious, dry sense of humor and a deep appreciation for political history. They argued over parliamentary reforms while the fire burned low, their debates sharp and unforgiving. He learned that she loved the smell of rain, but hated the damp it brought, that she preferred black tea with a slice of lemon, and that her favorite sound was the clatter of the new weaving looms in the village, because it meant the people were surviving. He was falling in love with a mind that outpaced his own, trapped inside a body that was actively failing her. It was an exquisite, daily torture. He watched her measure her breaths, calculating the cost of a sentence before she spoke it. He saw the quiet frustration in her eyes when she could not hold a pen because her hands shook too violently from the fever. Antonio walked over to her chair. He didn't hover, but he stood close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. "How is your chest today?" "Functional." That is a deflection, not an answer. "It is the only answer you require to report on the estate." She countered, looking back out the window at the dying summer light. Antonio crouched down so he was at eye level with her. He rested his forearms on his knees. "I am not reporting to my employer, Bailey. I am asking my wife how she feels." She stiffened. The word wife hung between them, heavy and foreign. She hated when he looked at her like this, with an open, raw concern that chipped away at the cynical armor she had spent years forging. Hope was a dangerous, exhausting emotion for a dying woman. If she allowed herself to believe he actually cared, the inevitable end would become unbearable. She did not want to leave him a grieving widower. She preferred him to remain a grateful business partner. It was cleaner. I feel like a woman whose lungs are composed of wet paper and spite, she said dryly, refusing to meet his gaze. Now, please go bathe. You smell like a mine shaft, and it is giving me a headache. Antonio let out a low, breathy laugh. He stood up, nodding. As you command, Your Grace. He left the room, but the air felt charged long after the heavy oak door clicked shut. Bailey pressed a trembling hand to her chest, feeling the ragged thumping of her heart. It was beating too fast, and for once it had nothing to do with her illness. Autumn brought the harvest, a massive surplus of grain, and Lord Reginald Stanton. Stanton was a relic from Antonio's previous life, a wealthy, indolent baron who had spent his youth draining London's gambling hells alongside the former careless Duke of Ashbourne. He arrived unannounced in a carriage bearing the heavy gold crest of his title, accompanied by a retinue of loud, exasperated servants. Antonio was in the stables, inspecting a lame mare with the farrier, when the carriage pulled into the courtyard. He handed the reins to a groom and wiped his hands on an oily rag, watching his old friend step down onto the cobblestones. Stanton looked exactly as Antonio remembered, immaculately tailored, flush with brandy, and radiating a bored arrogance. "Ashbourne! Good God, man, look at you!" Stanton bellowed, waving a gloved hand at Antonio's mud-spattered boots and coarse linen shirt. "They told me at White's you'd become a monk, but I assumed it was a jest. Have you taken up farming?" "Reginald," Antonio said, his tone devoid of warmth. "To what do I owe the intrusion?" "Intrusion? I've come to rescue you. It's been nearly 2 years. Surely you've served your penance in this dreary purgatory." Stanton looked up at the hulking grey facade of the manor, shivering theatrically. "I hear the industrialist's daughter is still clinging on. Morbid business, that. But surely you can leave the nurses to it and come back to town for the season. There is a new soprano at the opera who is entirely accommodating." Antonio felt a cold, quiet rage settle into his bones. It was a terrifyingly calm sensation. He looked at Stanton not as a friend, but as a parasite. The exact kind of parasite Bailey had spent the last 2 years purging from this estate. "The Duchess is resting," Antonio said, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "And my place is here." Stanton rolled his eyes, clapping Antonio on the shoulder. "Oh, spare me the dutiful husband routine. We both know you only married the coughing creature to pay off your father's debts. The money is secure now, isn't it? Let the girl expire in peace and come have a drink." Antonio didn't yell. He didn't throw a punch, though his knuckles ached with the desire to shatter Stanton's jaw. He simply stepped back, dislodging Stanton's hand. "Get back in your carriage, Reginald." Stanton blinked, his easy smile faltering. "Don't be absurd, Antonio. My horses are blown. I require a room." "You will not set foot inside that house," Antonio said, his voice like cracking ice. "You will not breathe the same air as my wife. The horses can rest at the village inn. You are no longer welcome on Ashbourne land." Stanton's face flushed a mottled, ugly red. "You are turning me away. Over a sickly, low-born ledger-keeper? That ledger-keeper saved thousands of lives last winter while you were losing your inheritance at the card tables." Antonio snarled. He stepped closer, his height and broader build forcing Stanton to crane his neck. "She possesses more intellect, courage, and worth in her fractured lungs than you will amass in a lifetime. Get off my property before I have the grooms throw you off." Stanton stared at the cold, unyielding violence in Antonio's eyes. He swallowed hard, muttered a curse under his breath, and scrambled back into his carriage. Antonio watched the vehicle roll out of the gates. His chest heaved, the adrenaline masking the sound of footsteps on the flagstones behind him. He turned, Bailey stood leaning against the stone archway of the courtyard entrance. She was wrapped in a thick wool cloak, the hood pulled up against the biting autumn chill. Clara hovered anxiously a few paces behind her, holding a hot brick wrapped in flannel. Antonio froze. He had no idea how long she had been standing there, or how much she had heard. "You should not be outside," he said, his voice instantly softening, the rage vanishing entirely. "The wind is damp. You will catch a chill." Clara said a carriage arrived with the Stanton crest. "I assumed you would require my assistance to calculate how much of the cellar he would drink." Her voice was raspy, pulling at her throat, but her eyes were fixed on him with an intense, searching weight. "He's gone," Antonio said, closing the distance between them. "I heard," she replied softly. She looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the dirt on his hands, the exhausted lines around his eyes, and the absolute, unshakable certainty with which he had just defended her to a man he had once called a brother. He hadn't defended her wealth. He hadn't defended his duty to the estate. He had defended her. A violent coughing fit suddenly seized her, shaking her thin frame. Antonio was there in a second, slipping his arm around her waist, supporting her weight as she doubled over. Clara rushed forward with a handkerchief, but Antonio took it, gently wiping the corners of Bailey's mouth when the spasm finally passed. She was gasping, leaning entirely against his chest. He smelled of hay, leather, and fresh air. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, medicinal scent of her room. She didn't pull away. For the first time in their marriage, she didn't try to stand on her own 2 feet. "I am tired, Antonio," she whispered into his coat, her fingers curling into his lapel. It was a surrender, not to the illness, but to him. "I know," he murmured. He lifted her effortlessly into his arms. She weighed no more than she had during the blizzard, but the burden felt entirely different. "I have you. I will carry you." He carried her through the entrance hall, past the stunned stares of the footman, and up the grand staircase. He did not take her to the east wing. He carried her down the main corridor, kicking open the heavy oak door to his own chambers in the west wing. The room was warm, the fire blazing, the massive bed turned down. He laid her gently on the mattress, pulling the heavy quilt up to her chin. He sat on the edge of the bed, brushing a stray lock of hair from her damp forehead. "Why here?" she asked, her breathing shallow, her eyes tracing the harsh, handsome lines of his face. "Because the east wing is where I put a transaction," Antonio said quietly. He slipped off the edge of the bed and knelt on the thick rug beside her, placing himself lower than her, stripping away the last remnants of his aristocratic pride. He took her frail, cold hand in both of his, pressing it to his lips. "This is where my wife belongs, if you will have me." Bailey stared at the man kneeling at her feet. The cynical wall she had built, brick by painful brick, finally cracked wide open. She reached out with her free hand, her trembling fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "You are a terrible nurse, Ashbourne," she whispered, a single tear slipping down her pale cheek to soak into the pillow. "I am," he agreed, closing his eyes and leaning into her touch. "But I am an excellent student. Teach me." Moving Bailey into the West Wing fundamentally altered the geography of their marriage. She did not miraculously recover. Her lungs remained a ruined battlefield, and the cold damp of the approaching winter still threatened to drown her in her own fluids. What changed was the isolation. Antonio systematically dismantled the boundaries between them. He fired the night nurse. He took the heavy velvet chair from his study and dragged it directly to the side of the bed, creating a permanent post. He learned the exact sequence of her medications. He learned that rubbing a heated flannel cloth over her collarbones eased the agonizing tightness in her chest. Clara, the maid, was relegated to daytime duties and bringing fresh linens. Antonio handled the dark hours. Nights were the hardest. Darkness amplified the terrifying rattle in Bailey's throat. November brought a creeping frost that clung to the windows of the manor, and with it came a vicious chest infection that stripped away the small reserves of strength she had built over the summer. For 3 weeks she could not lie flat. If she did, the fluid pooling in her chest would suffocate her. Antonio sat behind her in the massive bed, his back braced against the mahogany headboard, holding her upright against his chest while she slept in exhausted, broken fragments. He dozed with his chin resting on the top of her head, waking instantly whenever the rhythm of her breathing hitched or faltered. One evening in late December, the fever spiked dangerously high. Dr. Hayes had come and gone, leaving behind a grim expression and a bottle of strong morphine. Antonio was wiping a cool, damp cloth across Bailey's brow. She was shivering violently, her skin a terrifying, translucent grey. The fire roared in the hearth, throwing harsh, dancing shadows across the high ceiling, but she could not get warm. She caught his wrist with a trembling hand, stopping the cloth. Her grip was weak, barely enough to register, but the intensity in her sunken eyes pinned him in place. "Stop!" she rasped, the word tearing at her throat. "Stop hovering, Antonio." He set the cloth down on the nightstand, his jaw tight. "You are burning up. The doctor said we must keep your temperature down. Oliver Hayes is a mechanic trying to patch a boiler that is actively exploding." Bailey whispered. She let her head fall back against his shoulder, staring up at the heavy canopy of the bed. "I am tired of the patching." Antonio froze. A cold, absolute terror seized his chest, far worse than any fear he had experienced during the blizzard. He recognized the tone. It was the tone of a negotiator realizing the contract was void. It was surrender. "No," Antonio said. The word was sharp, clipped, refusing the premise entirely. "You do not get to quit. We have an estate to run. You just approved the plans for the new mill. You have to see it built." A weak, cynical smile touched her cracked lips. "You can build the mill, Antonio. You know how to read the ledgers now. I taught you well enough." "I don't give a damn about the ledgers!" His voice cracked, the aristocratic control shattering completely. He shifted, pulling her tighter against him, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He breathed in the smell of camphor and fever sweat, terrified it would be the last time. "I do not care about the mill. I do not care about the money or the title. I care about the woman who dragged me out of my own apathy. You are not allowed to leave me here." Bailey closed her eyes. The sheer desperation in his voice broke through the last, stubborn remnants of her pragmatic armor. She had spent her entire life preparing to die, quietly, efficiently, without making a fuss. She had trained herself to expect nothing from the world, and certainly nothing from the man forced to marry her. But Antonio had ruined all of that. He had given her a reason to resent her failing body. Tears, hot and unbidden, slipped from the corners of her eyes, soaking into the linen of Antonio's shirt. She let out a ragged, wet sob. "I don't want to go," she confessed, the admission stripping her bare. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever said. "I am angry, Antonio. I am so terribly angry that I found you, and now I have to leave." Antonio shifted, turning her gently so he could look at her face. He framed her hollow cheeks with his large, calloused hands. His own eyes were wet, his face a mask of raw, protective fury. "You are not going anywhere!" He swore, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He pressed his forehead against hers. "Do you hear me? You are too stubborn to die tonight. You will stay here. You will fight this, Bailey. I will breathe for you if I have to, but you are staying." He held her there, anchoring her to the physical world with sheer, brute force of will. He did not sleep that night. He held her upright, rubbing her back, forcing water past her lips, and talking to her, telling her about the crops, the tenants, the petty arguments in Parliament, anything to keep her tethered to his voice. Morning finally broke, casting a pale, weak light across the floorboards. The fever broke with it. Bailey slumped heavily against him, her skin cooling, her breathing dropping into a shallow but steady rhythm. Antonio leaned his head back against the headboard, his eyes burning, his muscles cramping from holding the same position for 10 hours. He looked down at his wife, listening to the quiet, hard-won sound of her breathing. They had stolen another day. He would take 1,000 more battles exactly like this one if it meant he got to keep her. Years did not bring a miracle. Medicine possessed no magic to replace scarred lung tissue, and the passage of time only compounded the damage inflicted upon Bailey's fragile frame. 5 years after she had nearly drowned in her own blood during the blizzard, Bailey Langley could no longer walk. Antonio had commissioned a chair from a carriage maker in London. It was a beautiful, functional piece of engineering, crafted from polished mahogany with large, rubber-rimmed wheels and deep leather cushions. Dr. Hayes had called her continued survival a medical impossibility, attributing it to a combination of meticulous care and pure, spiteful stubbornness. Ashbourne Manor had transformed entirely. The echoing empty halls were gone. Servants moved with purpose and respect, rather than fear. The estate was profitable, the tenant cottages were dry and warm, and the new mill in the lower valley provided steady wages for 100 local men. Spring had returned to the moors, painting the rolling hills in violent shades of green and gold. Antonio pushed Bailey's chair out onto the stone terrace overlooking the south gardens. He locked the wheels and tucked a thick, woven blanket securely around her legs. He was 37 now, his dark hair threaded with silver at the temples, his shoulders broader from years of physical labor on the estate. He moved with a quiet, grounded authority that had replaced his former aristocratic arrogance. Bailey sat in the chair, a heavy ledger resting on her lap. She was desperately thin, her hands resembling delicate porcelain, the blue veins stark against the pale skin. Her dark hair was pinned up elegantly, though the effort of sitting upright clearly taxed her. Yet when she opened the ledger, her eyes remained as sharp and terrifyingly observant as the day she had fired the corrupt steward. "The bricklayers for the schoolhouse are overcharging for the mortar," she observed, tapping a manicured fingernail against a column of numbers. Her voice was permanently reduced to a raspy whisper, requiring anyone who spoke with her to lean in close and pay absolute attention. Antonio pulled a wrought-iron chair closer to her and sat down, leaning over the armrest to look at the page. They claim the heavy rains washed out the local quarry, forcing them to import lime from further south. They are lying. I saw the quarry manifest yesterday when Mr. Miller brought up the post. They have a surplus. She closed the ledger with a quiet thud. "You will ride down there tomorrow and remind them who holds the lease on their storage yard." "I will," Antonio promised, smiling faintly. He reached out, gently taking the heavy book from her lap and setting it on the stone table beside them. "But the bricklayers can steal from us for one afternoon. You have been looking at numbers since breakfast." Bailey leaned back against the leather cushions, closing her eyes and turning her face towards the sun. The warmth felt good against her perpetually aching chest. "If I do not watch the numbers, Ashbourne, who will?" "I will," he said simply. She opened one eye, looking at him with a mix of affection and lingering cynicism. "You are adequate, I suppose, but you lack my ruthless disposition." Antonio laughed, a deep, chest-rumbling sound that seemed to chase the chill from the air. He slipped out of his chair and knelt on the stone terrace beside her. He didn't do it with theatrical flair. He did it with the practiced ease of a man who spent his life ensuring he was exactly where she needed him to be. He rested his forearms on the armrest of her chair, looking up into her face. He traced the deep, bruised hollows under her eyes, the sharp line of her jaw. To society, she was a tragedy, a wealthy invalid hidden away in the country. To Antonio, she was the architect of his redemption. I remember a time when a certain duke told me I was never his choice, Bailey murmured, reaching out to thread her thin, trembling fingers through the hair at the nape of his neck. Antonio didn't flinch from the memory. He turned his head, pressing his lips to the palm of her hand. He was an idiot, a proud, frightened boy who didn't know the difference between a burden and a foundation. He looked back up at her, his winter sea eyes dark with an absolute, unshakable devotion. He knew how this story ended. He knew there would be a winter that she did not survive. He knew the coughing fits would eventually win, and he would be left in this massive house without the sharp, cynical voice that anchored him to the earth. But looking at her now, feeling the weak pulse beating against his lips, he knew he would not trade a single agonizing second of their borrowed time. "You are my choice, Bailey," Antonio said, his voice thick with a love so heavy it felt like gravity. "Every morning, every breath, every ledger, you are my only choice." Bailey looked down at the proud Duke kneeling at her feet. She did not cough. She did not argue. She simply smiled, finally allowing herself the luxury of believing him, and leaned forward to rest her forehead against his. If this story broke your heart and put it back together, you know what to do. Hit that like button to help this channel grow and share it with someone who appreciates a romance that favors grit and survival over fairy tales. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another deep, emotional drama. Drop a comment below. Who was your favorite character and what historical era should we tackle next? Your support keeps these stories coming. See you in the next video.